ahead and jump back in. And we typically start each of the sessions with a little, sometimes overlapping, sometimes slightly different, brief mindful movement or mindful practice. So I thought we could, to get us back into the same space mentally, we could do a couple of the ones that we do together. So we'll start actually with a standing practice, if you want to just find a place somewhere. And then we'll move to a sit.
Not in front of the
You're like,
camera.
maybe I'll move right back and I'll be right there. All right. So I encourage you to stand with your feet about hip width apart, and you can close your eyes or rest your gaze on the floor in front of you. And really feel the contact that your feet are making with the ground. Feel connected and strong. And take a breath or two here, in through your nose and out through your mouth. And then slowly and mindfully, bring your arms up in front of you like you're holding a beach ball. And your fingers can be close together, but not quite touching. So imagine your arms wrapped around this beach ball, trying to get your fingers as close together as you can without having them touch. And while you're here, pay attention to the sensation in your arms, and your back, and your neck. What do you feel? What do you notice? And after one more deep breath, slowly and mindfully return your arms by your side. All right, and then if you want to find your way back to your seat, we'll do one more brief practice before we start talking about emotion. So again, I encourage you to get comfortable. Feel your feet on the ground or on the yoga mat or on the table, whatever it is. And your back straight but not stiff, and your head resting on top of your shoulders. Again, your eyes closed or your gaze on the floor in front of you. And take a deep breath in through your nose and let it out of your mouth like a soft sigh. And we'll just keep doing this a few times here, a few breaths. In through the nose and out through the mouth like a soft sigh. There's no right or wrong way to do this. Breathing in this way in through the nose, slowly. And out through the mouth like a soft sigh. Be very grounding and relaxing. So we'll do this just a few more times. And right now, all you need to think about is breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth. And pay attention to the in-breath and the out-breath until the sound of the bell. So that mindful breathing that we just did is one that we use to start several of the first few weeks. And then that holding the beach ball, that first one that we did, is one that we have used to start the emotion week. But in the beginning of the manual, in the first few pages are some great examples of very brief mindful movements that can be really helpful to use, and any of them are fine. Just kind of get people thinking about their bodies and moving mindfully, and holding beach ball is just one example of that. All right, so we are going to continue our discussion of what the specific theme looks like, themes look like, and following the same procedure of talking a little bit about the rationale and the research supporting why we are focusing on this, and then talking more about the nuts and bolts and nitty-gritty of the actual session. So the main takeaway of the E theme is to practice surfing the waves of your emotions, and that's an analogy that we'll come back to a lot. In particular, in one of the longer practices called Surfing the Waves that we'll do tomorrow as a group. I think tomorrow or Monday. And real quick, as a note, we'll be explicit, we are explicit in the program in this meeting about the fact that we'll use emotions and feelings interchangeably in the program to mean the same thing. Due to scientific advances, a key thing to understand is that we're really just beginning to understand in the last decade or so some of the ways that the brain develops during adolescence, some of which we talked about earlier this morning, and how those brain developments really underlie adolescent behavior and cognition. So the connection between what's happening in the brain and patterns of behavior and thinking that we typically see in adolescence. And so, of course, since we're talking about emotions, it's important to understand some of what we know about some unique characteristics of emotion regulation and emotional experience in adolescence, and the way that that can then play out in ways that are relevant for the program. So a traditional view was that adolescents were kind of emotionally unstable, that they displayed a lot of lability, a lot of changes in their emotional experience. And there is some evidence that in the adolescent emotional experience is unique in some ways compared to younger children and also older adults. So relative to both older and younger individuals, adolescents show greater pupil dilation to emotional pictures, which is an index of arousal in response to emotional stimuli. They report more distressing emotions on a daily basis, so they're more likely to report unpleasant emotions, sadness, anger. And they respond with more negative affect to neutral stimuli, compared again to both older and younger individuals. And they have greater recall for emotion-related words and delayed memory tasks, and show more interference in memory after seeing emotional images. So there's a lot of evidence to suggest, again, an emotional experience of adolescence is different, and that there's an increased sensitivity to emotional stimuli in ways that can also interfere with executive functions. Also interesting in terms of some unique characteristics of the adolescent emotional experience is what we know about emotion differentiation, or ability to detect and read and identify other people's emotional expressions or experiences. And so what we know is that in children, our children are pretty good at identifying emotions, but a relatively small set of them. So kind of the more basic emotions like happiness and anger. So they're good at it, but they're limited in terms of what emotions they can do this with. And then adults are pretty good on average in general. They have well-developed skills to be able to identify even relatively subtle emotions. But in adolescence, we see a dip in the ability to differentiate between subtle and complex emotions in particular, which can make it more challenging to actually read and identify other people's emotions. And so again, this is in particular to kind of more nuanced, more subtle emotions like disgust, fear, etc. So we see that adolescents are not as good as either children or adults at kind of reading emotions, which of course can lead to some challenges then because of the key of emotions to our interpersonal experiences. And also because of some of the changes that are happening that we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, we know that adolescent brains, and then adolescents themselves in particular, are highly sensitive to rewards and stress. That's kind of a period of unique sensitivity or elevated sensitivity to rewards, which often plays out through impulsive or risky behavior, which of course has risks, but also has the potential for things that make you feel good or are fun. So there's some rewards, and we often see this reward sensitivity played out through impulsivity and risky behavior, seeking thrill, seeking sensation, a pleasure orientation, especially with peers. So a lot of what we see is elevated when adolescents are with peers. But are also more sensitive to stressors, including anxiety and boredom, and as a result, there's kind of some expression or experience of unpleasant emotions relatively quickly, and a more dramatic, a more robust response to pretty strongly unpleasant experiences, or pretty strongly to unpleasant experiences. And in particular, we see that while the prefrontal cortex is developing, adolescents are much more, or the amygdala for adolescents exerts a much greater influence over their cognition and their behavior. So for adolescents and for adults for whom the prefrontal cortex is well developed, they rely on those mature cortical functions to regulate their behavior and their cognition. But adolescents cannot rely on those functions yet because it's still developing. And so they rely more on the amygdala to regulate some of those behaviors, which leaves them more sensitive to these issues of rewards and stress. So as an example of that, there was a relatively recent study that looked at likes on Instagram and its effects both in terms of, or the effects of behavioral liking and also through neuropsychological scanning measures. And what they found is that in high school students, but in not in college students, there was decreased activity in the prefrontal cortex as an index of cognitive control when they were viewing risky images. And so the takeaway message was that frontal regions, like the prefrontal cortex, are insufficient, particularly in adolescents, to control responses to emotional stimuli, which often are risky stimuli too. So one example, again, of the ways that these changes in the brain actually shape what's happening in terms of cognition and behavior in ways that can have real consequences for mental and physical health. And so what we know, some other really important things to understand, is that limbic structures in the brain, which are related to emotion regulation and emotional expression, develop much earlier than the prefrontal cortex cortical structures that regulate executive functioning. So we see that some of the emotional dysregulation we see is because of that disjoint, so that the brain regions that monitor and integrate and regulate emotions develop way before those executive functions do. And that can lead to some challenges, in particular increased risk of risky behavior. So this disjoint is one of the main reasons we think we see increases in kind of impulsive risk-taking and lack of control in adolescence. That then kind of increases dramatically, so this red arrow being risk-taking, and then decrease pretty dramatically after the prefrontal cortex is well developed and fully mature, but issues of cognitive control increase linearly. So this kind of, again, this disjoint between what we see, between what's happening in different brain structures and how that affects what happens in terms of behavior and cognition. So kind of the last research-based background thing that we'll talk about is the importance of distress tolerance. So in particular, emotionality is generally strong during adolescence. That is something you need to remember from being an adolescent. Many people who work with adolescents understand how intense and strong emotions can be, and that's kind of an important characteristic of this age group. And problems handling emotions that are unpleasant often reflects a low capacity to tolerate distress. So a real challenge with these unpleasant emotions is a challenge with a distressing stimuli, and so kind of low tolerance with your ability to manage those. And then that then, low distress tolerance, is related to a number of emotional and behavioral problems. A list of which is here. So kind of general harmful behavior, disruptive behavior, depression and anxiety, binge eating, gambling, self-harm, substance abuse, poor academic performance, and aggressive driving. So a bunch of behaviors that we likely would agree are problematic are linked to this issue of distress tolerance. And so if interventions that really target improving distress tolerance theoretically can also help regulate emotionality, which can be protective in terms of this range of outcomes. So an intervention like learning to breathe, again, one of the targets is really improving emotion regulation and increasing distress tolerance in the hopes that it will have some of these trickle-down effects on health and well-being more broadly. Any questions about that background before we turn to what the session itself looks like? All right. So the structure is similar. Again, all of the themes follow a similar organization. Do an opening mindfulness practice. Again, what we typically do is the two that we started with after lunch, so holding a beach ball and mindful breathing. But there are others as well that you could do as an opening mindfulness practice, and then a brief recap of what we learned and discussed in practice in B and R, and then an overview at the end of what we'll do in E, putting up the poster for emotions, using that as an opportunity to check in again, see how people are doing, are they practicing at home, what are they struggling with, what are the challenges related to the program. And then in terms of the introduction to E, laying the groundwork that emotions are a critical part of our experience, that they are part of the awareness triangle of body, thoughts, and feelings. So they kind of form the awareness triangle, so this is the third piece that we'll talk about. And so we're going to learn to pay attention to emotions, and like we did with thoughts, talk about the way mindfulness can help us deal with potentially unpleasant thoughts, feelings, just like we did with thoughts. And so often at the start, one of the first kind of activities to do together is just to talk about emotions. So what are emotions, asking for people to provide ideas and examples, and then also to talk about some characteristics of emotions, what they do for us. So again, a little psychoeducational component here, and coming to the important takeaway that emotions, pleasant and unpleasant, are important. And even unpleasant emotions can signal very important things to us. So they help us communicate. If someone signals to you that they're angry, for instance, that's important as a relationship partner. That can tell you important things. It helps us know when we should approach something or when we might be in danger. So things like fear and sadness, these are even unpleasant emotions, are really important. So again, starting to, in more detail, explore the idea that emotions are not bad or negative, but they can be unpleasant. But that they still serve an important function, even if they don't feel good, always feel good at the moment. And so then transitioning to an experience with the idea to learn more about them. And the key takeaway of this next activity is to actively demonstrate that emotions are universal. And it is not uncommon for adolescents to feel isolated and alone, and to feel like they are the only ones who are experiencing things. So this practice, this activity, can be very normalizing in a powerful way, and I'll describe it in a minute, but it is intentionally active, even though it's simple, to be much more powerful than just telling teens, everybody feels the way you do, but for them to actually observe that. And so it can be done two ways. It's called the lineup, and that's to reflect one way to do it is that you have everybody stand in a line. And then you read a series of emotions, and you have people step forward when they've experienced it and step back. And reading a variety of pleasant and unpleasant emotions, and of course, almost everybody steps forward, if not everybody, for each of the emotions. Another way to do this, if space is limited or this doesn't work, is to have people sit and raise their hands when they experience them. And so again, the intention is to really express, and for them to look around and see, wow, everybody is feeling the same, has felt the same things that I have felt. In the manual, there's more detail about an optional practice called How Does It Feel? And so you can look into that if there is time allows for it. In case I forget to say this later, if there is time for more attention to be paid to a topic, emotions is a really good place to do that because of how key emotional experiences and challenges with emotion regulation are. So if you have the time, this might be a practice to add in. And so as I've said, this idea that emotions are part of the awareness triangle of body, thoughts, and feelings. So there's another activity then to really continue with the theme of exploring emotions and what they're like and how they are important to us. And the point of this is to add to the discussion that we feel emotions in our body often, and that our emotions are connected to our thoughts. And so this is called emotion in 3 acts because you kind of separate it into 3 activities and then talk about the differences and similarities between them. And so the first act, participants are encouraged to walk mindfully through a room, through a space, usually there and back, if the space allows, encouraging people not to touch anyone else and not to make eye contact. And then the second act, and there's some discussion about how that feels and how that went, to walk mindfully but to make eye contact. And then the third and final act, which also can be done on its own depending on time, is called emotion charade. And people either think of an emotion, or you can give them a handout that has a list of emotions. And they pick one to act out. And you walk throughout the room with people enacting their emotions, and try and find people who you think are acting out the same emotion, and then come together. And then this leads to a discussion about how did you know? How did you know? And sometimes people have slightly different emotions that they were expressing, but usually sad and happy are not standing next to each other. And so how do we know that someone is expressing happiness? How do we know that someone is expressing fear? What did it feel like? Especially, well, for both pleasant and unpleasant, what did it feel like to act out happy? What did it feel like to act out sad? What were the thoughts that you had to kind of, again, lay that groundwork that our thoughts are connected to our feelings? And so again, to lead with or to finish with this key point, that emotions are felt, and they are felt in and communicated by the body. And so that grounding in the body is an important part of emotional regulation. And so that's part of the reason we talk about it. And then similarly to the way mindfulness of thoughts went, we transition to, okay, now, we've talked about all of us have unpleasant emotions. What do people often do when they feel emotions that are unpleasant? And again, there tends to be some discussion of avoidance or suppression coming out. And so in response to when usually people share that, we try not to feel them, we try and push them away, things like that, is to talk about, yeah, this is really common for us to do this, but it's actually not a healthy way to deal with unpleasant emotions. And so to talk about, let's see what happens when we cover things up. Let's think a little bit more about how that works as a strategy. And the goal is for participants to really think a little bit more and see evidence of, maybe in ways they haven't thought about, the short-term and long-term benefits, but especially costs, with covering up or suppressing emotions, or unpleasant or unwanted feelings. And so what happens with the great cover-up is you split up into groups, and you have each group come up with a situation that typically produces distress or stress, a breakup, a hard test, a fight with your friends, something like that. And then sometimes with guidance from you, work to find the underlying basic uncomfortable feeling. Is it sadness? Is it anger? Is it fear? And you have them put that on a card. And then they work together on pieces of notepaper to write down things that people do, stories they tell themselves, behaviors they engage in to try and cover up that feeling or to avoid it. And spend several minutes doing this, trying to think of as many examples as they can, and then have them report to the group. And also have discussion, or what are the consequences of this? If drinking, for instance, is a behavior that people engage in, what are the costs and the benefits of engaging in drinking as a way to, say, deal with your fear or your anger? And so out of this discussion, it comes that there are typically costs that are associated with these strategies to cover up or suppress our emotions, and leading to, does it work? Does it work to drink, to suppress or avoid feelings? And often out of that discussion, kind of leading them towards maybe in the short term, but usually not in the long term. That usually these avoidance and suppressives, right, like it comes back up, and sometimes it comes back up even stronger than before. So those are kind of the goals around the discussion, to bring up these ideas of the costs and the ineffectiveness of these strategies. So then transitioning to, okay, so we've kind of covered as a group, covering up suppressing is not beneficial. There are costs and it usually doesn't work. And so we need to think about other ways of dealing with unpleasant or unwanted emotions. And that mindfulness of emotions can do that. Basically the same strategy that we used with mindfulness of thoughts, we can apply it to mindfulness of emotions. And so surfing the waves, again, is a practice we'll do in more detail tomorrow. But this is the first time a short period of silence is introduced in these longer practices. And the idea is to allow for mildly unpleasant emotions, particularly boredom and restlessness. So you want participants to be kind of bored and restless, and then tackle them with, apply the mindfulness of emotions to these relatively benign unpleasant emotions, which hopefully lay the groundwork for dealing with more unpleasant emotions that are more intense and perhaps more challenging. But the idea is to practice some distress tolerance. Like most of us, when we're bored or restless, then we do something else. We try and fix or solve that unpleasant emotion and practice tolerating that distress and sitting with it in the hopes that that helps us better manage more intense negative emotions. So again, this is a topic that if there's space for more time to explore things, that it's good to do that. And one of the optional practices for the shorter sessions, shorter number of sessions like the 6-week program, is something called Finding the Feelings, which is we're going to do now. This is a slightly longer practice than we've done. If you want to grab a yoga mat or a bolster, you don't have to. You can stay sitting in your chair, but it'll be just a few minutes longer than the little ones that we've done. And so again, this is an optional practice, but can be a really helpful one, and so we'll do that now before we wrap up our discussion. You're all sitting? All right, so like we've done before with other practices, encourage you to find a comfortable position. And closing your eyes if that's comfortable for you. Getting as quiet as possible. And take a moment to find your breath in your body. Just feel its movement for a few breaths. So we're going to practice paying attention to feelings on the inside. We'll be paying special attention to where the feelings show up in the body. And remember that we're just observing the sensations of the body as they reflect the energy of the feelings. We're not trying to change anything or cover anything up. Just remember that feelings are like waves. They come and go. We can surf their waves. Remember too that anytime you can bring your mind back to the focus on your breath, using your breath as an anchor to calm yourself. Let's start with happiness. See if you can experience what happiness feels like in your body. To help you do this, you might remember a time when you felt happy. Notice the sensations in your body, perhaps in the area of the heart. What are the sensations like? Are they warm, light, bright, loud, or soft? That's you sit here feeling happiness, be curious about this feeling. Notice if it gets stronger or if it fades away. Now choose to investigate a mild but uncomfortable feeling, maybe worry or anger. See if you can begin to experience worry or anger in your body. Notice any sensations, perhaps in your belly, in your shoulders or back, in your forehead or jaw. What are the sensations like? Are they hot? Tight? Burning? Cold? Sharp? Do they move around? Or are they fixed? As you sit here, be curious about this feeling. Notice if it gets stronger or if it fades away. See if you can observe it without covering it up. Bring to mind the feeling of peacefulness. See if you can experience what peacefulness feels like in your body. To help you do this, you might remember a time when you felt peaceful.